Hello, everyone. I wanted to tell you about two trips we're sponsoring this year. Part of our Geo Tours portion of the Skeptic Society is our social and science explorations. The first one is June 2nd through 16th, so 14 days, 2 weeks, from Ireland to Iceland on a cruise ship with none other than Richard Dawkins. This is the Passage from Ireland to Iceland, we're calling it. And Richard Dawkins will be the invited guest and lecturer, where you can hang out with him for 2 weeks. As on this ship, the Vega, it has a guest of 152 people that can join. So it's not a big, huge cruise ship with thousands of people. So you get to intimate time with Richard. It starts in Dublin and goes to Reykjavik as we explore Europe's northernmost islands, Scotland's Hebrides, Orkneys, and Shetlands, Denmark's Faroes Islands, and Iceland. A remote world known for its rugged landscapes, picturesque villages, fascinating history, and nature lovers' delights. The second trip is from Greenland to Canada's Nova Scotia. We're calling this Wonders of the Arctic on the same ship, just a 152-person ship called the Vega. It's a beautiful ship. Our featured guest for that trip, which is September 23rd through October 10th, is Jared Diamond. Yes, Jared. So we have Richard Dawkins and Jared Diamond, two of the biggest names of our generation, two of the greatest minds, both good friends. Just picture just sitting on a ship, just hanging out with these guys. So, of course, they're lecturing, but breakfast, lunch, and dinner, they're just sitting around, and you can sit there and chat with two of the greatest minds of our time. This second trip, September 23rd through October 10th, goes from Greenland to Nova Scotia with a bunch of different stops in between. So check it out. Go to skeptic.com/geology_tours, or just go to our website, skeptic.com. You'll see it prominently on the homepage there. Again, skeptic.com/geology_tours to get access to those and sign up. These are big fun trips. I mean, I've done a bunch of these myself. And it's just great to be able to spend so much time with such great minds of our generation. All right. Thanks for listening. Here's our podcast. Ernest Scheyder, he's a senior correspondent for Reuters, covering the green energy transition and the minerals that undergird it. He previously covered the U.S. shale oil revolution, politics, and the environment, and held roles at the Associated Press and the Bangor Daily News. A native of Maine, Scheyder is a graduate of the University of Maine and Columbia Journalism School, the J School. Cool, that's the big one. You can visit his website at ernstscheyder.com, SCHEYDER.com. Here's the new book, The War Below, Lithium, Copper, and the Global Battle to Power Our Lives. Ernst, thanks for coming on the show.
Hey, it's great to be with you, Michael.
I had no idea about any of this. I'm the perfect host for this conversation because I don't know anything about this subject till I read your book. It's like,
we're going to have a lot to talk about.
Holy crap, we're in trouble. I mean, I really, I'm one of these Americans that like, what's the big deal with China? I mean, who cares? Like, oh, now I see. But before we get into that, I just wanted a subject that comes up often on this show and in my line of work is fake news and journalism and what we should believe and what's true and so on. And as you know, the trust in journalism has not been super high recently. You work for Reuters. You used to work for AP. My sense, I don't trust Fox and CNN and MSNBC and the American One or whatever that far right news. And there's several other sources like that I don't trust. But I tend to trust Reuters and AP and probably the big three, ABC, CBS, NBC. I sort of feel like they're trying to do it right. Could you give us some insight as a journalist at these institutions, why we should trust you? Because I think we should. But, because of all the other stuff, craziness that's going on, people don't know what to believe.
Sure. Well, first off, it's great to be with you, Michael, and with your audience. I would say that certainly I would agree with you. Trust in media, unfortunately, is at a low right now. And that's due to factors that are probably beyond the scope of this conversation, or else we'd be here all day. I would say that Reuters and organizations like the AP and others put a high value on trust that we earn. We have one relationship with the reader, and that is trust, or the viewer or the listener of our journalism. And we put high import on getting the facts right, on transmitting them respectfully, responsibly, and getting them out in the world so that people can make informed decisions for themselves. At the end of the day, it's our job to show what's going on in the world, and to bring that to our audiences, and to help them make better informed decisions about the world around them. And so a place like Reuters, we have things called the trust principles that basically are our North Star for how we operate. That basically means we strive for freedom from bias, that we spare no expense to cover the news, and there are a few other trust principles as well. But that guides what we do, and I've been thankful to work at a place at Reuters that really values hard-hitting journalism, honest journalism, and the respect for our viewers and our readers.
And are there principles like if we cover Trump, we better cover Biden, or if we cover this Democratic senator, we better cover a Republican senator? Some kind of balance there?
Well, I think you have to go where the news takes you, right? So it all depends. Reuters has been around for more than 150 years, and we've covered heads of government from all over the political spectrum. And so the way that we cover whoever is in the White House will depend certainly. Well, let me rephrase that. We would cover whoever's in the White House the same way, regardless. How we would write a story would depend on the news of the day, certainly. But we report without fear or favor. Whether it's politics or whether it's the environment or whether it's business or energy story, as the war below is. And so that's really what makes me proud as a frontline journalist at Reuters, is to know that we are just asked to get the best story, to get the best side, to help tell the best story by talking to all sides, because often there's more than just two, and to bring to readers a cohesive, informed, and meaty piece of journalism that helps them make better sense of the world.
Yeah. So in J school, like in Columbia, they have, you take classes on how to do all this, right? Fact checking and multiple sources for stories, and you don't take people's words for it, and so on.
Yes. Yep. And there's multiple ways to corroborate information and to really dig into the meat of an issue, and not just take one person's word for it, even two persons' words. We live in an age of data, thankfully, and so much is verifiable or at least corroborated by reams of data that are out there, whether it's from government agencies or NGOs or other sources, financial documents, et cetera, et cetera. So there are plenty of ways out there to dig into the core of a story, if you'll forgive the mining pun.
Yes. Okay, that's pretty good for here. Yeah, one of my favorite movies is Shattered Glass, the story of Stephen Glass, who's a fabulist at the New Republic, right? Yeah, the New Republic.
Yes. Yep.
Just made up stories, like hundreds of stories that did not get properly fact checked. That probably changed fact checking systems in journalism.
It most certainly did, and I think rightfully so. Everyone needs a good editor. I do. Every other journalist out there needs one, and I'm thankful for editors every single day.
Okay, how'd you get into this story? What's your background?
Sure.
Besides,
so
after college.
So I joined Reuters after 2 years at the Associated Press, and I had the great opportunity to dive into the beginning few years of the U.S. shale oil revolution. And I was based in New York, so I wrote a lot about the Marcellus Shale and the Utica Shale, which are in Ohio and Pennsylvania, and got a great opportunity to dive into the complexities. We all remember sort of the early years of the shale boom that made the U.S. what it is today, the largest crude oil producer in the world. And then 2014, Reuters came to me with an offer. They said, "Why don't you move to North Dakota?" And I,
what?
And I was living in New York City at the time. And North Dakota has the Dawkins Shale, which is this massive oil deposit that lies underneath the state. And it was helping to revolutionize the state's economy. I think many people forget that North Dakota was experiencing a bit of a brain drain. A lot of its youth were leaving the state. The fact that the word North was in its title was considered a pejorative, and the state legislature actually considered dropping North from the title to actually attract more people to the state. But then
Why?
the shale boom happened. It was just considered a pejorative, to have North in the name, associated with cold or winter or something.
Oh, I see. Okay.
So the oil boom happened, and the western part of the state, especially this town called Williston, experienced this massive influx of cash. And so I went there as part of a one-person assignment to cover it for about a year and a half, 2 years. And the economy was just going gangbusters at the time. My rent in North Dakota was more than double what I was paying for an apartment in New York City, if you can believe that.
Wow.
And so I did that for about a year and a half, 2 years, decided that that was a good experience for me. And then I moved to Houston, where I wrote about Exxon and Chevron and OPEC for a few years. And then in 2018, I had the opportunity to jump into the critical mineral space. I started to see the early machinations of a big ramp up in demand for a lot of these critical minerals. And I became curious about what that would mean for not only the United States, but the broader global economy. And I've been covering that ever since. And the more that I reported on this space for Reuters, the more I started to see a narrative thread emerge for the book, for The War Below. I chronicled several proposed mines, both in the United States and elsewhere in the world, and started to see strong opposition to it for various reasons, whether that was due to indigenous rights reasons or conservation and environmental reasons, or any number of other reasons. At the same time, you started to see from governments in Washington and Brussels and elsewhere in the world huge demand projections for electric vehicles and for other clean energy devices. And so both of those things cannot exist at the same time. If you're going to have more electric vehicles and solar panels and wind turbines, you need to have more metals and minerals to build those things. And I really started to see this narrative thread emerge around the issue of choice. And for me, that's what this book brings to people, is this idea of choice. That's the core issue. Writing this book has taught me, and other authors might disagree, but I've come to believe that the author gets one question to ask his or her audience. And the question that I'm bringing here to the audience is, what are the choices we're willing to make if we want an energy transition? And it's about not only addressing climate change, but also about all the electronic gadgets that power our everyday lives, whether that's cell phones or laptops or the millions of other devices that are powered by lithium-ion batteries that you and I and your listeners and so many others use every single day. So we're not having the conversation right now about where we get cobalt from, or where we get nickel from, or lithium, or copper, or any of the other critical minerals and metals. And I think that we should be, because if we learned anything from the coronavirus pandemic, it's that extremely long supply chains can not always be good. I mean, it was 4 years ago this month, Michael, that we all discovered the United States doesn't make any masks. I mean, that's just sort of a silly, innocuous example, right? But
Yeah.
but it just, if you extrapolate that to the entire energy transition, and you start to realize that right now the United States doesn't make any cathodes, and a battery has a cathode and an anode. So you can't make a lithium-ion battery without a cathode, and the United States doesn't make any of those. It produces only trace amounts of lithium right now. It produces very, very little copper or nickel right now. And other nations in the world are very willing to use their clout in these areas as economic weapons against the United States and against others. And so we have to be having a deeper collective conversation about where we want to get these. Where are the places that are too special to mine? Where are places we're willing to mine? And then how we're willing to grow this new part of the economy in order to have the energy transition that so far we all collectively we say we want by our actions.
Mm-hmm. So, bigger picture here, to run a civilization, you need energy. So traditionally, the energy, since the Industrial Revolution, has been fossil fuels, coal and oil and natural gas. Now we know there's a problem with greenhouse gases and climate change, so we have to do something. Okay. But your point here is that, but you have to make a choice, because mining is not cost-free. Yeah, let's just go all renewables, and let's just do all this cool electronic stuff. Let's have all electric vehicles. I've been on board with that. I have an EV. Like, that seems so cool. But of course, when I charge my battery, I realize it's not the electricity fairy giving me free electricity. It has to be generated somewhere. And the more of these we have, I don't even know how the battery works in my car. Can you explain basically the old nickel acid batteries versus these lithium-ion battery? I don't even know how does it work?
Yeah, so the quick and dirty is a lithium-ion battery has sort of two parts. It has a cathode and an anode. Well, that's the two big parts, shall we say. I don't want to get sort of too technical on you. And the ions flow one way during charging and the other way during discharging. And lithium is obviously a core component, as the name would imply. It's a lithium-ion battery. But depending on the design, and different automakers and different manufacturers will have different chemistries that they prefer. You might either have more nickel or more aluminum or more cobalt in there, depending. You'll obviously have copper, would be a huge component, and for the wiring as well. And so the ions, like I said, flow one way or the other, depending on whether you're charging or discharging. Once the power is discharged from the battery, it's then sent to in an electric vehicle, it's sent to a rare earth magnet. And these can be thought of as basically the engine for an electric vehicle. They turn power into motion. Another great analog is the cell phones that are sort of ubiquitous everywhere. The device that makes it vibrate is a rare earth magnet, and that's turning the power from the battery into motion, which is the vibration in this case. And so then that turns the wheels, and then off you go. That's a quick and dirty oversimplification of it, but that's in essence the inside of the electric vehicle. And that's why it has far fewer parts than, say, an internal combustion engine. And so you can sort of understand why it's perhaps maintenance is a lot easier. You don't have an oil tank to change. On the flip side, because they accelerate so fast, you do tend to need special tires. That's perhaps a conversation from a different day, but you can also start to see just the sheer need for a lot of these critical minerals and metals, because most of your quote unquote motor here for this electric vehicle are all critical minerals. And that lays bare sort of the stark demand right now that's out there.
Yeah. So I always like Thomas Sowell's comment that there are no solutions, there's just compromises. Don't aim for a utopia because that's not there. Here's the problem is reading from your book here about where you're quoting Mark Senti, chief executive of the Florida-based rare earth magnet company Advanced Magnet Lab, talking about the reality of mining. The United States wants to go green, but to do that, it will need to produce more metals, especially lithium, rare earths, and copper. That means more mines, and mines are very controversial in the United States. Who wants to live next to a giant hole in the ground? Mines are dusty, increase truck traffic, and use dynamite for blasting that can rattle windows and crack foundations. Many mines throughout history have polluted waterways and produced toxic waste that scarred landscapes for generations. They also require astronomical amounts of water to operate. All right, so yeah, okay, so that's the problem. But then you go, okay, well, let's stick with oil. Well, that's not going to fuel our iPhones.
Right. And I would point out that you can't recycle oil. Once you've burned it, it's in the atmosphere doing its damage. The beauty of copper and other critical minerals is that you can, especially if battery recycling technology advances even further, reuse those metals and minerals. So that is the hope that at some point in the future, we're going to get to what's called a fully circular economy. So we'll take your old cell phone, my old cell phone, all the old cell phones we have in our drawers, we all have them, old electric vehicles, and be able to turn them in and reuse the materials inside to make new cell phones and new electric vehicles. But, if you just look at the sheer demand projections for all these electronic devices over the next 10, 20, 30 years and do the math on the back of a napkin, you realize that there's going to be a need for more mines for the foreseeable future. So estimates range all over the map as to when we'll sort of hit that tipping point for a fully circular economy. Some say 2050, some say beyond. But what I will say is the mining industry right now knows that it's coming eventually, and you already are starting to see some mining companies prepare their business models to accept recycled material down the line. Albemarle, the world's largest lithium company, being one of them.
Here's another excerpt on this problem. Too often, old electronics are just thrown away. Without more electronics recycling, the world's landfills would mushroom to completely unmanageable size, while at the same time, global reserves of cobalt, nickel, and other metals will be depleted. Each year, about 50 million tons of electronic waste is generated. 50 million tons? That's astonishing.
50 million tons. It's a crazy number, right?
An amount roughly equivalent to every single commercial airline plane ever built? Holy crap. Yet, only about a fifth of that amount is actually recycled. Without some intervention, by 2050, the number will jump to 120 million tons each year. In 2019, all the EVs put on the road generated about 500,000 tons of battery waste, a figure that could hit 8 million tons by 2040. Wow. Okay. So, like everybody else, I went and got my new phone because Verizon said, hey, we'll give you a new phone for free. And here's the new system you get. Blah, blah. Okay, whatever. What do they do with those phones?
That's a very good question. I will say that different manufacturers are approaching this differently. Apple some would say is certainly leading from the front here. So as part of the reporting for the book, I got a chance to visit an Apple facility in Austin where they have this giant robot that they've nicknamed Daisy. And what Daisy does is it's basically a giant robotic arm with other bells and whistles. And Daisy basically tears iPhones apart, old iPhones that have been used, so that they can be sent on to recyclers. So think about the screen, the shell, the battery inside, the device that I mentioned earlier that turns power into motion for vibration. It takes all of these things apart sort of with ruthless efficiency. And I was sworn to secrecy when I was in there. I couldn't film anything, or so I'll share some photos with you. But it's a pretty extraordinary device that Apple sees as key to its part of what it believes is ending the mining industry as we know it. And I would say Apple certainly has the budget and the prowess to be able to move towards that goal. And when you look on their website today, they talk about how certain of its products are made with fully recyclable materials. And they're getting there sooner than perhaps than other manufacturers. But of course, Apple is just one company among the many, many, many other companies out there. So how we move towards this fully circular goal, I think there'll be fits and starts in the coming years, and that will just further reinforce the need for more mines.
Is this something that the government regulators could nudge companies toward doing more recycling through, say, tax breaks to do that?
I think certainly, and the Inflation Reduction Act has been a huge beneficiary of companies like Li-Cycle and others. Various parts of the Biden administration have already given grants and other financial incentives to Li-Cycle, to Redwood Materials, and other companies that are focused on recycling. So I would say that is perhaps the carrot rather than the stick approach that's being used right now. I'd be curious to see what the implications would be for the consumer right now. Think about it in some states when you have, say, a soda can or a beer can, you get 5 cents back if you turn them in. Like I grew up in the state of Maine, you could get 5 cents back if you turned in a can. You couldn't in the state of New Hampshire, for instance. And so that financial incentive to get that 5 cents back that you paid when you bought that can certainly was there, and that was high. The lead acid battery industry for the internal combustion engines, right now, when you have an internal combustion engine, it's just sort of matter of fact. If you need a new battery, you turn it in and you get a new one. And there's been a whole infrastructure built up around taking that lead acid battery, breaking it apart, and reusing the component parts. And so we've got to get to a position where it becomes almost sort of second nature, where if you have to turn in your electric vehicle battery or even your old cell phone or other device, that you do turn it in. It doesn't just sit in your drawer if it's a household electronic, and those metals and minerals inside can be reused. And is there a financial incentive to do that? Is there a way to carrot rather than stick that? I think policymakers should be exploring that, and they perhaps will more and more as the years advance.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, these batteries are huge. The entire bottom of my car is the battery.
The battery is your car, yes, basically.
I mean, I'm just sitting on a battery with 4 wheels. And I see electric vehicles all over the place. I mean, and I have a Tesla, but there's a lot of them that are even nicer than Teslas, and they're not that expensive now. And I don't see why we wouldn't have 100% EVs on the road within, I don't know, by 2050 or some such thing. So obviously this is going to be a problem. Why haven't our politicians met with the, I don't know, CEOs of these big companies and go, okay, what do we got to do? Because we have, practically no mines, and China has most of the mines, and you have that map. Let me just show this map because it's pretty stark about where these mines are compared to, the United States. And, we have all these little dots on on the map there. But how many of them produce rare earth minerals like this and so on? What do we need to do politically to make this happen?
One of the things that I increasingly came across the more I reported out this book is the reality that the US federal government speaks not with one voice, but often with multiple voices on a project. And one of the main minds that I explore in the book, the narrative arc, if you will, for the entire story involves the Rhyolite Ridge lithium mine project in Nevada. This is about 200 miles north of Las Vegas, and it's a massive deposit of lithium that this company known as Ioneer would like to develop. And the problem at the site, if you will, is that there's a rare flower found nowhere else on the planet that loves this lithium-rich soil. It is this little small flower. It's about 6 inches tall. It's got these beautiful blue leaves. When it does flower, it has these beautiful golden rods that just look stunning. And this flower is found nowhere else on the planet. And so the tension becomes, if the lithium was extracted via an open pit mine, you probably would destroy the habitat for this flower. And so I explore in the book the tension point between the company and a key conservation group that's fighting for this flower's survival. At the same time, you've got the US government considering whether to declare this flower an endangered species. The US Fish and Wildlife Service spent years diving into the history and the biology and the botany of this rare flower and this plant at this specific site. Meanwhile, the US Department of Energy was considering, should we lend this company $700 million? Should we move forward on the permitting process? Those two things seem like they could be completely at odds, because why would you lend the project $700 million if the flower at the site was declared endangered? And so I explore that tension a lot in the book, and I'll let the readers discover for themselves what happens at the end. But that, from the outside looking in, did not seem as if Washington was speaking with one voice about how it was approaching the project. And so I'm not unique in pointing this out. Oftentimes people point out what's called the Washington silo effect, where one arm doesn't know what the other arm is doing. And that was just sort of one main example. Another example from the book that I explored through the reporting was the Resolution Copper Project in Arizona. This is about an hour east of Phoenix. It's a massive deposit of copper underground that Rio Tinto and BHP would like to mine. But in order to mine it and extract it, the mine would cause a crater about a mile wide that would destroy a site of religious significance to many Native American groups in Arizona. And so the question becomes, what matters more, the copper or the Native American religious rights? And President Trump approved the mine project just before he left office. President Biden then unapproved it a month or two later, and it's sort of been sitting in this position of holding pattern ever since. Meanwhile, there's been a separate lawsuit that's been going on. And even though President Biden unapproved the mine, his lawyers have been fighting for the mine in court. So it seems like a bit of whiplash there and not speaking with one voice about the strategy. And here we are in early 2024, and the mine is still stuck on the fence. It's not approved. It's not disapproved. It's just sort of in this period of uncertainty. And so it's confusing, I would say, from the outsider looking in. While Washington might say it wants all-electric futures for all of us, at the same time, there are specific projects across the country that, for various reasons, have various legitimate opposition, and some of them are on ice. And those would strongly decrease the country's ability to produce more of these critical minerals for itself.
And that one's on public land, you said?
Yes. Yep.
Yeah. Well, there's part of the problem. Who owns the public land? Well, the federal government. But how did they come to own it in the first place, right? So, Native Americans certainly have some claim to this, given the history. Whenever something valuable was discovered on Native American lands, for which we already signed a treaty, the federal government just broke the treaty famously in the 19th century over and over and over again. It's pretty bad. So I don't know what the solution to that is. It's like maybe this is part of messy democracy. But, you're touching on something important there, that the federal government has more than one motive, and they're often in conflict. You have conflicting rights. Life is just full of conflicting rights. You can't have everything. Something's got to give. And yeah, I don't know. I mean, I don't even know how it works. So if I found lithium on my property, can I just do whatever I want with it? Or do I need permission from the county or the state of California?
That's a great question, Michael. And let's just say you owned 1,000 acres in Nevada. What would you do if you wanted to develop a lithium mine there? Where would you start? It's an extremely confusing and myopic process. And the number one thing I heard again and again and again as I was researching and reporting out this book is, who do we talk to? Where do we go? What are the steps we need to take? And you might discover, if you're 18 months in, that all of a sudden you've got to file this paper or talk to this office that you didn't even know existed before. And it's not just a problem for the mining industry itself. It's also a problem for the conservationist and environmental communities that either might oppose mining or might want to encourage more responsible mining. If the process is so confusing for anyone from the outside to figure out, you can imagine it just causes a bit of sclerosis and inactivity, and it doesn't lead to producing more responsible lithium and copper and nickel and cobalt and other critical minerals that are so essential for this energy transition.
Oh, that brings up an interesting question. I had another podcast guest talking about property rights. Like, I don't own the atmosphere above my house all the way up into space. I can't block planes from flying over my house, right? And I assume I must go down too, right? I mean, if I want to drill 1,000 feet into the land that my house sits on and have a big hole there, my neighbors are not going to like that. And surely there must be laws about certain things I can and cannot do to the dirt my house sits on.
I mean, I'm sure it would depend on the local jurisdiction, but generally, I mean, legal statute says that you own to the center of the earth from your property. And
Really?
obviously, that could depend on the different state and whether or not you have the mineral rights for your property. In North Dakota, when I was based there, it was very common for people to own the physical surface land, but not the oil underneath it because the mineral rights and the surface rights had been severed. So it all depends on the state, really.
Oh, I see. Okay, so the state owns the mineral rights.
Not necessarily. Let's
No?
just say 200 years ago, you purchased this 1,000 acres and you had the mineral rights and the surface rights, but now you have great, great, great grandchildren, and that 1,000 acres has been parceled out to 5 200-acre lots, and 3 of your descendants sold the mineral rights during the Great Depression, and 2 held on to them. So you can sort of see how it would just get confusing the more the web expands out further. But in that scenario, 2 of your descendants would have the mineral rights and the surface rights and be able to sell the oil, and 3 of your descendants have sold them, and so they could be owned by anyone.
Wow. Okay, this is why we have court systems, I guess, to sort
Yes.
these things out.
I can tell you in North Dakota and Texas and other oil-rich states, it's a very, very common thing for judges and lawyers to be engaged in.
Really? You mean companies sue each other, or different landowners sue each other, or what happens?
More like the provenance of the mineral rights and trying to figure out who, the chain of custody, etc. So that generally tends to be the situation that they're engaged in. A lot of probate action.
Yeah. Okay, so you used to work in the shale oil, covering the shale oil business, right? So the United States recognized decades ago we have to have more independence and make our own oil and so forth. Why are we not doing that now with these rare earths?
That's a very good question, and I really hope the war below sparks this collective question about where are the places that we actually want to mine. We're not having that collective discussion now, and I really hope that we do have that collective discussion. A stark example, and I don't mean to be alarmist or extremist, but much of the world's cobalt right now comes from the Democratic Republic of the Congo, and it's not uncommon for young children to go onto mine sites and with pickaxe and hammer, break open the earth and get rock and go and sell it to a middleman who then puts that rock into the cobalt processing supply chain. And that cobalt can end up in any number of electronics across the world. Now, sometimes those children can be maimed or even killed as part of this process. Cobalt rock, when it's ground up, can turn into a dust that can get into your lungs and severely irritate the insides of your body. I don't think anybody in their right mind would say that we should have a 7-year-old mining the cobalt that goes into the world's electronics. But at the same time, are there places that we're comfortable extracting that cobalt in the United States? One of the chapters in the book focuses on the Twin Metals proposed underground mine in northern Minnesota. And this is a massive deposit of copper and, yes, cobalt and nickel. And the problem for the company has been that this deposit sits underneath a giant watershed that feeds into the Great Lakes. And the cobalt and copper and nickel is inside a type of rock that, when exposed to water, can turn into acid. And so the big concern is that if you take this rock out as part of this underground mine extraction process and it gets exposed to water, could that acid then leach into the waterway that would pollute the Great Lakes? And you can think of the Great Lakes as sort of the beating heart of the North American waterway infrastructure. Obviously, you can see that would be a huge problem, right? How would you even begin to clean that up? I should say that the company that wants to develop the project, it's called Twin Metals. It has been very, very vocal about the safety standards that it plans to implement if the mine's approved. But there's a strong opposition from folks both in Minnesota and elsewhere that say that the risk is just too great. Like, how could you even consider the potential damage to these waterways and to the Great Lakes by doing this? That there are other places to get cobalt and copper and nickel. Why should we be doing it here? And so that brings up a lot of interesting questions, right? I mean, should we really be doing it elsewhere? Can we be mining safely and securely there in northern Minnesota? Right now, the mine is in, again, a bit of stasis, just like the Resolution Project in Arizona. It's essentially been put on ice by President Biden. That could be reversed by another administration down the line. Congress is debating right now whether to actually permanently ban it. So we'll see what comes there. But this is a massive deposit that is essentially on pause right now.
Wow. Okay. So maybe it comes down to the uncertainty of what unintended consequences there could be once you start a mining project like that. The mining company can say all they want, well, we're going to be really super careful and follow all these guidelines, but they may not anticipate things that are going to happen down the line.
Sure. Tomorrow is an unknown, right? For me, for you, for a mining company. I mean, the unknown is magnified that much greater when you're dealing with a giant hole in the ground and a giant, storage facility for all the waste that you take out of that hole in the ground.
Yeah. I like the cover of your book because you can't really tell how big those trucks are. But if I'm not mistaken, those trucks are like the size of a house.
They are. Yep. It's massive. And those are the kind of trucks that go through most mine sites across the world. It's just gargantuan. As part of the book, I visited the Morenci mine in Arizona, which is the largest mine on the North American continent. It's operated by Freeport-McMoRan, this massive copper company. And you saw those kind of trucks all over the place. I mean, this is a mine that's got at least 4 or 5 open pits, and it just goes for acres and acres and acres. And it produces copper through several methods. And so for me, it was important to show the reader in the book sort of just the scale and the scope of a huge operating mine. And you got a real sense in that chapter just how big of an operation that Freeport runs every single day there.
Yeah. Yeah, my friend Matt Ridley's got an estate up in England that has been his family for centuries, and he has a huge mine, a coal mine on his property that the Queen, I think that it's the Queen's coal or something like that. He doesn't technically own it. In England, they have different laws, something like what you were talking about. But anyway, when I stayed there one time, we went out to visit, and the trucks were like these on the cover of your book. I'd never seen anything. The tire alone was the size of a house. It's like, who makes this stuff? Obviously, there's a market for it.
Huge market, yep.
But when you fly over the United States, or you drive across the United States, or in my case, you ride your bike across the United States, there's a lot of just nothing out there, just open land, particularly in the Western United States. So who would object to like the place you just described in Arizona? It's nowhere near Tucson or Phoenix, right? And it's out in the middle of nowhere. Who cares? I guess environmentalists care, and Native Americans.
Well, at the Resolution Copper site, you've got Native American groups that have been occupying this land for centuries. And at the specific site that Resolution Copper wants to develop, this project, a lot of Native American groups hold coming of age ceremonies for teenage girls as they mature, and for each girl will have a multi-day ceremony of prayer and song and dance. They also consider this site the entry point to the Apache version of heaven. This is what they've been describing to me, and so they see a huge religious importance on this site. And so for them, and what they transmitted to me, was to destroy this site would be destroy a place that they consider the home to the angels that they worship. And so you can really start to see sort of the visceral pain there. I mean, the comparison that came up time and time again as I was reporting this book is, would you destroy St. Peter's Basilica if there was a bunch of cobalt underneath it? Probably not. And would you destroy any other sort of religious site, Westminster Abbey, et cetera, St. Patrick's Cathedral? And so that's the comparison that is often brought to me. And what I was at pains in the book to do is to not really bring my perspectives into this, but to show all of this to the reader and to talk to all sides here about the complexities of these issues. Because there's also an economic situation here as well. I mean, near to this deposit is the town of Superior, Arizona, and the average income there right now is about $20,000 per year. Now, Rio Tinto and BHP are saying that the average pay, if the mine opens, would be about $100,000 per year. So you just do the basic math there, and you can see that the town really, really wants this mine to open. And I had the great opportunity to meet with and interview the mayor of the town. Her name is Mayor Emila Bisic, and she is laser focused on only defending her town and its economic potential and opportunity, but also not bending over backwards for the mining companies. I have this great anecdote in the book about how the mining companies offered about $250,000 or $300,000 a year in annual subsidies for things like fire and police and water. And she just did some basic math and realized that, no, that's not going to fly. We need at least $1 million. Oh, and we need you to clean up this old mining site from a company that was here 75 years ago that has nothing to do with you, but we need you to clean this up. And so she really held their feet to the fire and said, this is going to benefit our town and it's going to benefit you. So let's do this together. And so that came through loud and clear in the narrative. And that's why when I was talking earlier about how there's multiple sides always to an issue, here was a great example of how finding sort of a third or fourth perspective really added to the narrative.
So it's going forward.
We'll see. I mean, that Resolution Copper project right now has been on ice from President Biden. We expect a court ruling. I know it does get confusing after a while to track them all, but I promise you the narrative flow in the book is clean and succinct.
Yeah, no, it is.
But the Resolution Copper project is on ice right now while President Biden decides what to do. Meanwhile, a federal appeals court could rule any day. We've been waiting for that ruling for more than 10 months.
And is it political, like we often hear? The Republicans, the right, they want to drill, baby, drill, and the Dems want to conserve and the environment and so on.
I tell you, Michael, it's political in a way that is not necessarily Republican versus Democrat, but it is political because a lot of people in Arizona vote, and especially Native American tribes. And when you look at the exit polling from 2020, you realize that President Biden narrowly won Arizona because of the Native American vote. Exit polling proves that out.
Really?
And so he heavily courted the Native American vote. He made it clear to them, and his running mate, Vice President Kamala Harris, made clear to them that they would actively listen and give Native American groups a seat at the table, in their words. And indeed, they honored that promise by putting the resolution project on ice right after they were in office. And so it's very much political in that sense. And you see politics swirling around everything here. In Nevada, one of the proposed projects that I chronicle in the book is the Thacker Pass lithium mine, which is opposed by a group of, I would say, pretty extreme environmentalists that advocate for a deindustrialization, as well as Native American groups that don't want the mine developed. The project also was opposed by a bunch of ranchers that were concerned that the mine would destroy water table levels in the area, and thus they had no way of watering their cattle. But you know who votes a lot in Nevada? Native American groups and ranchers. And so the senator there, Cortez Masto, was up for re-election, and she came out in support of lithium in the United States, but not in support of this specific mine, which I detail in the book. And she won by only 7,000 votes out of 1 million votes cast. So extremely narrow margin there. And so you can see how these issues are not just about manufacturing anymore. They actually become very, very political.
Yeah, I mean, I support a lot of environmentalist causes, but it seems like, if you try to be too pure to one extreme, here's the solution to climate change. Get off. We got to get off fossil fuels, like the people that threw the soup on the Mona Lisa yesterday.
Yeah, I did see that, yes.
Okay, but they'd probably also be against everything you're talking about in this book. We don't want mining either. Well, then how are we going to power civilization? And nobody can possibly be in favor of let's get off all energy sources and go back to burning wood and cow dung or something. I mean, it's just ridiculous. We have to move forward somehow and make these compromises.
There are some that would say we need to deindustrialize, and there is a group of them that I chronicle in one chapter of the book that would say we need to not have electric cars, we just need to have no cars and no more cell phones and no more laptops, and we need to be having more farming and more sustainable actions in our own personal lives. Is that practical for the billions of people on the planet? Probably not. But this is a key argument that is getting more and more attention. And this particular group ended up on the front page of the New York Times. Bill McKibben gave them a shout out in the New Yorker. And so for me, it was important to include that perspective here in the book.
Do they really believe that, you think? I mean, since you met them, I mean, is that your sense? They're hard.
I do.
Yeah. Okay. And how do they coordinate their efforts? Do they use cell phones? They text each other.
They do, and I explore this in the book. I'm not going to be able to do it justice by memory, but essentially, this group is advocating a use of the tools at hand to achieve the desired end game, and the analog for them is, these are the tools that we have to advocate for our cause, and so this is what they said to me, and folks can believe them or disbelieve them, but that's their perspective.
Yeah, I don't know. It seems like going backwards is never the right solution. I also don't like the hypocrisy of telling third world nations, you can't use fossil fuels because we already did it and look what happened. So you can continue burning cow dung and wood. This is not good. How about make them as rich as possible, as fast as possible to get them through the fossil fuel stage into the next stage. But now I see there's another issue after reading your book. Okay, so that next stage is not without pretty deep consequences as well, mining. Okay. But maybe if we move forward with it, there are technological solutions to the problems caused by mining. And in other words, there's always going to be problems, but the problems are solvable. And there'll be new problems, but those are solvable.
Right. One of the, I guess, most fun chapters to write was about the jewelry company Tiffany. And this is sort of the iconic company with the, light blue boxes. You buy engagement rings from there. And I did not, when I started this project, expect to have any interface with Tiffany. But Tiffany helped about 10 or 15 years ago create this nonprofit known as IRMA, or the Initiative for Responsible Mining Assurance. And its CEO at the time, Mike Kowalski, was a fervent conservationist and really started to think through, where does Tiffany get the gold and the silver and the platinum to make engagement rings and other jewelry that it sells? And it wanted to make sure that the metals were ethically sourced. And so, working with environmental groups, Tiffany helped found IRMA. And IRMA's goal is to do exactly what you were saying. What are the best mining standards out there? We do and will need mines for the foreseeable future. So let's talk about the best way to operate a mine and to run a mine. And so it took a long time. It took about 10 or 15 years for IRMA to help craft standards. And part of the reason that took place is because it wanted so many different groups in the same room. It wanted conservationists and environmentalists in the same room as mining companies, with labor unions, with indigenous groups, with investors, with regulators. And you put all those people in a room and it sounds like a wrestling brawl, right? I mean, when I first heard about this, I was like, there's no way this is going to work. But the group did find that over about 10 or 15 years, it was able to slowly cobble together these standards for what it considers best mining. And so IRMA is slowly starting to roll out now, and you're starting to see companies put their mines up for IRMA certification. And a lot of the certification schemes that have been out there have either been sponsored by the mining industry in the past or other groups, and so they haven't necessarily had as much buy-in from the public. But what IRMA aims to do is say, okay, here are the standards by which we expect a mine to conserve water, to pay its people, to create a culture of safety, to let its neighbors know what is going on at the site, and if there's an accident or some other incident, to know how they're going to be alerted, and many, many other standards. And then IRMA sends somebody to the site to basically review the operations and say, this is how the mine stacks up against them. And then the results are publicly posted. So you and me and everyone else on the planet can look up that data. And for companies that buy lithium and copper and cobalt, they increasingly are wanting to know where and how and why the metals that they buy for these batteries are produced. And so you've got companies like Microsoft and BMW and Ford that are saying that they want to get to a point where they only buy IRMA-approved metals. And so we're starting to move in that direction. It's got a handful of mines that have been what are called IRMA audited right now. But for me, it was just an important, I would say, inflection point, really, in how the world responds to the mining industry and how the world says, this is the way we are going to insist that metals and minerals are produced for the green energy transition. And having groups as wildly different as a jewelry company, Tiffany, an environmental group like Earthworks, a tech giant like Microsoft, and an automaker like BMW all support this. I mean, to me, that made a great inclusion for the broader narrative here in The War Below.
Yeah, so certification, reputation, the value of reputation of a company that is not buying natural resources from exploited workers, say. That you could do
Huge.
through
Yeah.
social media, through political action, through environmental activities, not throwing soup on the Mona Lisa, is not doing it. but I take your point. If it's done correctly, is it your sense that we mostly know how to do safe and effective mining, and there's enough labor laws and workers' rights that people know what's the right thing to do? So it's just a matter of giving the right incentives to, say, the political regime in some country or the company that's being run there?
I think we have to remember that as much as we don't want it to occur or maybe want it to change, these are still global industries. And you might have huge companies that are answerable to shareholders that are leading the mining industry, like a Rio Tinto or a BHP or a Vale. But you also have huge countries like China and India, where still some of the safety standards and labor standards are not fully known. A great example, if you'll just bear with me for a few minutes, involved about 5 years ago in Brazil, the Brumadinho tailings dam collapsed at a Vale-owned iron ore mine. This was horrible, horrible accident. And a tailings dam basically stores the waste from a mine. So just sort of rough numbers, if every 100 pounds of rock you pull out of the ground, depending on the metal or mineral, let's just say it's copper, maybe 1 or less than 1% of that could be copper. So you imagine roughly 99-ish pounds of waste has got to be stored somewhere, and it's mixed with water and a bunch of other things as part of the extraction process. And so you take that muddy goop and you basically build a tailings dam that just gets higher and higher and higher. And there are safety standards for building tailings dams, and there are different types depending on the type of the world you're in. You can imagine that if you're in an earthquake-prone zone like Chile, you might have a different design than you would someplace else in the world. But unfortunately, this tailings dam in Brazil that was owned by Vale was known for more than a decade to have safety issues, and one afternoon collapsed and killed more than 300 workers. And the video, you can access it online. It's horrendous to watch. And it's at a huge reputational risk for the global mining industry. Vale is one of the world's largest companies, a major mining company, and for it to happen there had huge ramifications. And so that sparked a huge inquest by a lot of investors into how safe is the mining industry. And the Church of England used its pension fund from its retirees. It had worth 3 or 4 billion pounds. It invested into a lot of these companies. It used its financial weight to basically insist on more data on tailings dams at major mines across the world. And I worked with them, and I basically helped tabulate all of this data. It took me a long time. But I say all that sort of in a bit of a long-winded story there to say that none of the data came from Chinese or Indian dams, tailings dams, or mine sites. They did not participate in the Church of England scheme. And so those are huge holes in the data set there. And so there's so much we just don't know. And so while we can certainly want to have global standards for mining, we're not quite there yet. And we know that there is a lot of metals and minerals that come out of those countries and others that might not participate in these certification schemes that still are supplying the global supply chains. So I would argue that there's huge holes that are not going to be filled until consumers increasingly demand more and more information.
Right. I guess so. Again, it's an incentive structure in which, let's say, Apple says, "Look, if we make all our iPhones in the United States, they're going to cost 3 times as much. So what do you want? An iPhone that costs $500 or one that costs $3,000 or whatever it would be." And I don't know.
Well, I mean, I think think about the textile industry, right? Bangladesh has been a huge home for many textile manufacturers for some time. But it was, I believe, a few years ago, there was a giant fire at a Bangladesh textile factory, and it sort of exposed the over-reliance on Western manufacturers on these atrocious conditions in Bangladeshi factories. I don't think anybody would want a cheap t-shirt knowing that it was made by a sweatshop worker in atrocious conditions that were potentially life-threatening. And so are people willing to pay a bit more for a quote-unquote safer t-shirt? That's a bit of a basic example, I'll grant you. But I think when you start to explain to people that the way to have cleaner and greener devices goes beyond just carbon emissions, it also goes to how we respect other human beings on the planet, I think that centers the mind.
And what's the safety record of these Chinese mines? Do we know?
Well, I'll tell you a little story about the world's largest rare earths mine. It's in Inner Mongolia, and it's the rare earths there are intermingled with iron ore. So you basically can kill two birds with one stone. So you can imagine the economics are great for this. But rare earths can be very nasty to process, if you'll forgive the basic word, and they can produce a lot of radioactive waste. And so part of the book I explore, there is this waste pond for rare earths at this large Chinese mine that's bigger than Central Park in New York City. It's just filled with this dewy, goopy, junky detritus of the rare earths production process. That would never fly in the United States. I mean, can you imagine that here? That would be a no-go from the very, very beginning. And that's just one mine there. And so there's a lot about Chinese standards for mining that aren't fully known or grasped by the broader public here. So what we do know, though, is just sort of this example I'm painting for you, is that that kind of operation would not fly in the United States or Western nations.
Yeah. Yeah, that's part of the problem there. And it's cheaper to buy from China. Right. I mean, once you dig into this, it really gets complicated. If you were to advise the current administration or the next administration about how to deal with China or some of these other countries, what would you recommend?
Well, I don't know if it's necessarily my role to advise the Biden
Yeah.
administration, but
Yeah.
I would say that the Inflation Reduction Act's goals certainly are to maybe not necessarily yank industry back from China, but to build up what's here in the United States. And so we're starting to see some money move and really help bolster the U.S. industry. But what I was mentioning earlier about sort of confusing approach by different parts of the U.S. federal government, I think that, speaking with a clearer voice could help everyone here broadly. Also, the main law that governs mining in the United States has been around since 1872. That's kind of mind-boggling when you think about it.
Yeah.
And it needs, many people say that it should be updated. It has some interesting quirks in it. For instance, the 1,000 acres that we were talking about earlier that you hypothetically control in Nevada, if that's federal land that you happen to control, you don't pay royalties on anything you take out of the ground there. So you're not paying royalties to the federal government. But if you were an oil company in the Gulf of Mexico, for instance, you would pay royalties to the federal government for that oil. So there's some interesting quirks here. And that's part of the reason why when you look just at the EV supply chain, you can make a lot more money selling lithium to the EV supply chain than you can actually building an electric car, which is crazy when you think about it. Mind-boggling.
Yeah. I just had some more quotes here I liked from your book here. Let's see, from Elon. You're quoting Elon here. We want to figure out what are the limiting factors for accelerating the advent of a sustainable energy future. And whatever those limiting factors are, Tesla will take action on those limiting factors. So right now, we think mining and refining lithium appears to be a limiting factor and is certainly responsible for quite a bit of cost of growth in sales. It's, I think, the biggest single cost growth item right now, percentage basis. Although just for those who don't totally know this, the actual content of lithium in a lithium-ion cell is maybe around 2 to 3% of the battery cell. The average price, and then you write, the average U.S. Price for an EV jumped to $66,000 that summer, up 30% from the prior year as lithium prices spiked and amid rising demand and little supply. Tesla imposed one of the biggest price jumps. Right. So, I mean, I know Elon wants to get those prices down to like $30,000, $40,000 a car, that kind of thing.
He does, yes. And I mean, he's right about refining. I mean, we've been talking a lot about mining here during this conversation, but once you take the rock out of the ground, you have to do something with it to put it into a form that's usable in a battery. And different manufacturers have different types of lithium, for instance, that they prefer, whether it's called carbonate or lithium hydroxide. Each have different performance characteristics. And that requires highly specialized equipment to be able to do that. So right now, actually, Tesla is building a lithium refinery on the U.S. Gulf Coast in Texas. And what's unclear right now is where it intends to buy most of the raw material lithium from, but it's still in the the construction process. So it's got time to finalize that or to publicize those plans. But the US is going to need a lot more of these processing facilities domestically in order to further enhance its electric vehicle goals and sort of lithium-ion battery manufacturing goals broadly. And we're not there yet.
Yeah. Yeah. Do you want an oil refinery in your backyard, or do you want a lithium refinery in your backyard?
I mean, the only beauty there, I'll just point out, is of course lithium is recyclable. So
Yes,
maybe
right.
you're not doing
Right.
as
Okay,
much
another
damage to the environment as you would have thought.
funny factoids I learned in your book about electric leaf blowers and weed whackers. I did the same thing you did. I'm going to be very environmental here. I'm going to use electric weed whackers.
That was a fun chapter to write, and as I was writing the book, I did get a lot of questions about electric vehicles, and as we were saying earlier, not many people own them yet due to various factors, range anxiety or cost. So I was really trying to bring home to the reader that these issues are much broader than just transportation. And so a few years ago, I found myself buying a house with a backyard. And like you, Michael, I decided to go all in. I got an electric lawnmower, an electric weed whacker, and yes, an electric leaf blower to deal with all those pesky leaves in the backyard. But as I was writing the book, the question came to me, where did the lithium come from inside the battery? I mean, where did the copper come from? Did the cobalt get extracted by a small child in the Congo? And I tell you, I've got a lot of resources in my day job and certainly with the book. I couldn't figure out where the metals came from. And I tried pretty hard. And that's just for sort of an innocuous leaf blower. Now magnify that problem by the millions and millions of battery powered devices that we use every single day. Where does the copper come from in your cell phone or the rare earths? It's very, very hard to figure out that provenance. And my theory and my expectation is that increasingly consumers are going to want more and more of that information. They're going to want to know that they're buying a device that's built with metals that weren't produced at atrocious labor conditions, where the staff made, more than $1 US per day, that they mine didn't gobble up all this water and keep it away from the local population. They're going to increasingly want that because we all know what the petroleum economy got us from the 20th century, right? We got climate change, we got a conflict, and we got a big cartel in OPEC. And so if we're not thinking through these questions now, are we going to repeat those same mistakes? And so I think automakers especially are keenly aware of this. And so I think that's what IRMA and other certification schemas are trying to at least get a handle around from the very beginning to front run these questions that people are having about all of these battery powered devices.
Yeah. Yeah, I do think these are another example of collective action problems that all of us have to work together to solve. I had Naomi Oreskes on the show. She wrote this book called The Big Myth. The big myth being that free market capitalism can solve all problems. Well, no, it can't. Like big things like the electrification of the entire country was first the railroads, and then the electrification of the entire country. And so no private company wants to, run a line down some nowhere place to give electricity to this one farmer down there. And so the incentives get tilted toward just taking care of the urban centers and leaving the rural areas empty. And so It takes government to say, no, you're going to do that, and we're going to give you the incentives and support and subsidies and so on. And that's how the railroads worked. It seems like that's the long-term solution here. We really do have to get off fossil fuels in the long run. Maybe it takes another century. I don't know. But that should be a goal. And your book has identified all the other problems doing that. But, there should be a way to solve those problems and continue to move forward.
Yeah. I would hope so, right? And I would hope that The War Below sparks what I consider a very necessary conversation about these tough issues that we all face as a world. To your point, I mean, it's going to take everyone putting their heads together and thinking through whether or not we are willing to accept huge changes to the physical earth, maybe near where we live or in other parts of the country that we enjoy visiting, in order to produce the building blocks for our everyday lives. You can't just show up to a store and expect to get a cell phone. Electric vehicles don't just grow on trees. These things come from somewhere. And so we have to be thinking about where, how, and why we get them. And that, for me, like I was saying, was the North Star as I was writing The War Below. And at its core, it's also a book about people and about community, because there are communities that are affected by the choices we make or the choices we are refusing to make, either purposely or through inaction. And so you really get to see through the book's narrative the visceral human side of this pain on some sides and frustration on the others as folks go for and against certain projects across the U.S. and the world.
Yeah. That's a good place to stop, Ernst. Thank you for your work. Thanks for the book. I wish everyone in Congress would read this book because it's an eye-opener. I suspect most have no idea the details of what's going on here and how important this is going to be.
Well, I was honored that earlier today, U.S. Senator Lisa Murkowski tweeted about the book. She read it and she loved it.
Oh, nice. Okay, good. Let's get the rest of them on board.
Awesome.
Right.
Well, Michael, it's really great to be with you.
Nice to be with you. Hope the book does really well.
Thank you. Have a great day.